On Friday, the EU Statistics Authority, Eurostat, published its revised GDP figures for the first quarter of 2026. According to the data, on a quarter-on-quarter basis, the EU economy actually shrank by 0.1%, well below expectations and a notable downgrade on the 0.1% growth that Eurostat originally forecast in its preliminary estimates, which were published in late April. At first glance, you might interpret this as yet more evidence of Europe's alleged stagnation, and the unreliability of statistical authorities more generally. But when you dig into the data, it quickly becomes clear that the scale of this revision is almost exclusively down to one country, Ireland, where GDP apparently shrank by a staggering 12.1% in the first quarter of 2026, pulling the rest of the EU down with it. In fact, if you exclude Ireland, the EU actually grew at about 0.2%, slightly more than the 0.1% that Eurostat provisionally estimated. So, in this video, we're going to dig into the numbers and explain how Ireland might have single-handedly pulled the EU into a recession. European politicians don't really talk about the energy transition anymore, but that doesn't mean it isn't happening. In fact, Europe has quietly redoubled its efforts at decarbonisation. In the latest issue of our magazine, we look at this rare good news and why the energy transition has ended up looking different to the one we envisioned. That's just one of 80 pages in the magazine, because there's more in too long than you'd expect. Purchase your copy by clicking the link in the description. Now, before we get into Ireland's undeniably funky data, a couple of caveats. First, we know that a recession is usually defined as at least 2 consecutive quarters of negative economic growth, and it is thus at least a bit premature to say that Ireland has pushed the EU into a recession. However, there's a bit of wiggle room here, and even if it hasn't happened yet, it's very possible that the EU will end up experiencing 2 quarters of negative growth, given the second quarter of this year will be dominated by Iran-related turmoil. And second, it's obviously not wholly fair to blame the entire EU-wide contraction exclusively on Ireland, and the only reason that Ireland, which only accounts for something like 3% of the EU's overall GDP, was able to single-handedly pull the EU into a contraction is because the rest of the EU isn't doing brilliantly in the first place. Nonetheless, Ireland's 12.1% contraction in the first quarter is undeniably funky, and it is just mathematically true that, if Ireland had posted GDP figures anywhere within the normal range, then the EU would have seen positive rather than negative growth. So, what's going on? Well, the narrow answer is that most of the massive fluctuation in Ireland's headline GDP numbers recently is down to pharmaceuticals. For context, lots of big pharmaceutical companies like to set up their manufacturing operations in Ireland for tax purposes. Not only does Ireland have a famously low corporate tax rate of 12.5%, one of the lowest in the world and well below the 21% rate in the US, pharma companies can pay even less tax by selling the drugs that they manufacture in Ireland to their own subsidiaries in the US and other markets at inflated prices. This makes it look like their Irish subsidiaries are making all the profit, and their American subsidiaries and subsidiaries in other countries are making basically no profit, or even a loss, so they have to pay even less tax. Somewhat ironically, this practice was very much encouraged by the corporate tax reforms Trump introduced in his first term, with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, or TCJA. The TCJA was supposed to address tax evasion by US multinationals by creating a new tax called the Global Intangible Low-Taxed Income, or GILTI, which applies to foreign income, at least for certain big multinationals. While the specifics are a bit complicated, the basic problem is that, thanks to various exemptions, the GILTI rate is usually 10.5%, half the US corporate tax rate of 21%. This has created a very explicit incentive for multinationals to keep their production offshore, and explains why pharmaceutical exports from Ireland to the US actually started booming after 2017. Anyway, this has all been a lucrative accounting exercise for Big Pharma, but early last year it looked like the party might be coming to an end, when Trump signalled that he would be imposing tariffs on Irish pharmaceutical exports, nominally in an attempt to bring pharmaceutical manufacturing back to the US. This would have been disastrous for these pharma companies. Not only would it make it harder for them to sell to the US market, which is by far the biggest market in the world when it comes to pharma, tariffs would make it harder to sell their drugs to their American subsidiaries at inflated prices. Because, while they might help the pharma companies downplay their US profits, inflated prices would also mean higher tariff costs. So, after Trump's comments, pharma companies started exporting as many drugs as they could from Ireland to the US, to get as many into the US market as they could before the tariffs came into play. This is a process known as front-loading, and it happened across the entire US economy as importers rushed to build up their stockpiles before the tariffs. In practice, this meant that Irish exports to the US surged, and because exports contribute positively to GDP, Ireland's GDP surged with them, growing by 8.8% in the first quarter of 2025 alone. By the way, this was great news for the EU's headline GDP figures. Ireland actually accounted for something like 40% of the EU's headline GDP growth in 2025. However, in the months since, it's become increasingly clear that Trump's tariffs just aren't going to be as disruptive. This is in part for legal reasons. As you probably already know, most of Trump's Liberation Day tariffs were struck down by the Supreme Court, and the administration is now trying to essentially recreate them via other legally dubious means. But it's mainly because, while Trump has indeed announced a whopping 100% tariff for pharmaceutical imports coming into the US, pharmaceutical trade between the EU and the US is covered by the EU-US trade deal, which means Irish pharmaceutical exports to the US are only subject to a manageable 15%. Furthermore, the vast majority of big pharma companies, including Pfizer, AstraZeneca, Novo Nordisk, Eli Lilly, and GlaxoSmithKline, have been able to negotiate bespoke deals with the White House, whereby they have essentially promised to invest some amount in the US in exchange for reduced tariffs. The point we're trying to make is that Trump's tariffs haven't been anywhere near as disruptive as Big Pharma originally thought they would be, back in early 2025, when they started front-loading. So they've basically gone back to what they were doing beforehand. This is why Irish exports to the US have basically fallen back to where they were in 2024, and this has taken Irish GDP back to, well, basically where it was in 2024. In much the same way as Ireland's original export boom buttressed the EU's headline GDP figures last year, the consequent bust has bruised them this year. All in all, this should serve as a reminder that, well, you really can't trust Irish GDP figures anymore. When a story like this breaks, the headlines aren't just fast, they're fragmented. Depending on where you get your news, you might be seeing a completely different version of the same event. So, how are you supposed to know who and what to trust? It can be overwhelming trying to read into language and tone to figure out a particular bias. Well, luckily, Ground News will do all that work for you. Ground News is a website and app that helps you make sense of the complex and ever-changing media landscape. With thousands of articles being thrown at us every single day, it may feel impossible to just understand a story, never mind fully comprehend the bias behind each outlet. Well, Ground News puts all of those articles into one place, finally giving you an effortless way to consume news and digest media bias. And within each article, you can even find comprehensive breakdowns into the ownership, bias distribution, and factuality. Take this story on Ireland putting the EU into a recession, for example. We can see that there were 12 sources currently reporting on it, with most of the coverage coming from the left. Taking a look at the headlines, we're able to understand the differences in reporting on each side, with the left focusing more on Trump's tariffs and the right shifting the emphasis to the large revision in Irish data. And it's not just the stories we see that shape the narrative, it's the ones we don't. With Ground News' blind spot feed, you can see all the stories you might not have seen on your feed, both local and international, keeping you fully informed even outside of your media bubble. And this is so important, as a Duke University study finds that exposure to news blind spots can moderate positions and reduce issue polarization. So, if you want to start questioning the narrative, you can join Ground News today, and using our link, you'll get 40% off their unlimited access Vantage plan. All you have to do is subscribe through the link in the description, go to ground.news/TLDR, or scan the QR code on screen, and you'll be supporting an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.